Hello everyone, this is BL Confession Room, a channel dedicated to telling forbidden BL stories that will leave you speechless. This is the story of an Omega who signed a surrogacy contract expecting silence and control, but walked into a mansion where three unloved children called him Dad from day one. Don't forget to support the channel with a like and a subscription so you don't miss new forbidden BL stories you can't look away from. And tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. The Omega's name was Eden Gray, a name he had learned to keep small, not because he had been ashamed of it, but because the world had charged interest on being seen. A name on a lease became a trail. A name on a clinic form became a file. A name said aloud in the wrong room became a price. He lived in a sublet above a closed-down bakery where the windows were papered from the inside, and the staircase smelled of damp flour. The air still carried burnt sugar and dust. Eden's room had one narrow bed, one chair with a loose leg, and a kettle that whistled too loud. He kept his belongings in a single suitcase he never fully unpacked. Staying ready to move was a habit that had kept him alive. The dispatch center where he worked paid late and paid less. Nights blurred into days under fluorescent lights while he routed deliveries for strangers who never learned his face. When his heat suppressants ran low, he cut doses the way people cut bread during shortages, pretending the body could be negotiated with. The headaches and sudden waves of scent that made him hold his breath in public, he swallowed them down with cheap water and one hard rule: do not become noticeable. By the time the last notice arrived, printed on thin paper and shoved under his door, his hands shook before he even read it. Past due. Final warning. He pressed the sheet against the wall and stared until the ink stopped looking like letters and started looking like a cliff. He found the surrogacy brochure at a pharmacy counter, wedged between vitamin ads and a poster about prenatal care. The cover showed a clean smile and a promise of safety. It was written in gentle language: support, dignity, partnership, yet the details inside were all math. Compensation that could erase debt, medical coverage, a discreet residence. Eden read it again and again, each pass slower than the last, as if repetition could make it less real. The agency office sat high in a glass building that reflected the sky like it had nothing to hide. Inside, the lobby smelled of citrus cleaner and quiet money. The coordinator greeted him with practiced warmth that stopped just short of intimacy. Eden sat with his hands folded in his lap, nails digging into skin, while she spoke as if she were explaining weather, dietary restrictions, monitoring requirements, travel limitations, confidentiality obligations. The words fell into place with the soft click of a lock. Eden nodded at the right moments. He signed preliminary forms. He submitted to a blood draw and a scent profile and a scan that reduced his body to charts. Each test felt like another small removal of self. He told himself it was temporary. The lie tasted familiar. The contract arrived in a thick folder, pages clipped and numbered, margins tight with clauses. It outlined his meals, his movement, even the environments he was allowed to enter. It required a location tracker, a medical bracelet, weekly reporting. It also required silence. Silence about the intended parent, silence about the residents, silence about anything he saw, heard, or learned. The penalties were described in calm, exact language that made his stomach drop. The intended parent was listed as a single alpha guardian. His name appeared in business magazines beside gala photos: Callum Hale, polished smile, tailored suit, the kind of man who belonged in every room. His wealth was described politely as private holdings. His home was called a residence. His requirements were called non-negotiable. Eden understood what that meant: no room for mistakes, no room for weakness. In the final meeting, the coordinator slid the signature page toward him and waited. Eden stared at the line where his name should go. For a moment, it felt like the paper was asking him to disappear. He heard himself whisper, "Just get through it." The pen was heavier than it should have been. When he wrote Eden Gray, the letters looked too confident for the life behind them. As soon as the ink dried, the coordinator flipped the page and covered his signature with a stamped copy, as if his name had already served its purpose. He signed because survival rarely came with dignity attached. He signed because the money promised that he could stop bracing for disaster every morning. He signed because the agency promised he would be alone, monitored and untouched, a quiet pregnancy behind guarded gates, followed by a clean exit, a body with a timetable. When he left the building, the sky was the color of pale metal and the wind cut through his jacket. Eden walked past people who moved like they had somewhere safe to return to, repeating the same thought like a prayer. No attachments, no mistakes, no one will notice. He did not know that he had just stepped into a story where loneliness had already taken 3 small shapes, and they were waiting in a house that had forgotten how to say the word home. The car that picked Eden up did not smell like public life. It smelled like leather warmed by hidden heaters, disinfectant from a place that never allowed illness to settle, and something expensive that did not have a name. The driver spoke only once, a clipped confirmation of his identity, and then returned to silence as if words were a liability. Eden sat in the back seat with his suitcase between his knees, one hand resting on the handle like it could anchor him. The windows were tinted enough to turn the city into a moving blur. Street signs, corner shops, people waiting for buses, all of it faded behind dark glass. The route was smooth and deliberate, not the kind of driving that followed traffic, but the kind that followed permission. As the city thinned, trees replaced buildings, and the roads stretched into long, quiet lines. Eden watched the world change as if he were being rewritten by distance. With every kilometer the car gained, the life he had known felt less real, like a room he had already locked behind him. His phone had no signal for most of the drive. The agency had told him it was normal. Privacy, they had called it. Eden knew another word for it. Isolation. He tried to breathe steadily. He tried to remember the contract's promise. Alone, monitored, untouched. A quiet pregnancy. A clean exit. He repeated those phrases in his head until they stopped sounding like comfort and started sounding like a sentence. The gates appeared without warning, iron bars rising out of hedges trimmed so precisely they looked artificial. A guard booth sat to the side like a small, silent witness. The driver slowed, presented credentials through a narrow opening, and waited. The cameras rotated toward the car, tracking it with calm attention. A soft click sounded, and the gates parted as if the property itself had decided Eden was permitted to exist inside it. The mansion rose beyond the drive, pale stone and wide windows, too perfect to feel lived in. It looked like something built to impress people who never stayed long enough to notice what was missing. The landscaping was immaculate. The fountain water moved like it had been choreographed. Even the air felt filtered, carrying only faint traces of cut grass and polished wood. Eden's first thought was not awe. It was fear, thin and sharp. Places this expensive did not tolerate mistakes. Inside, the entry hall opened into a corridor with ceilings too high, as if the house needed extra space to hold everything it refused to acknowledge. The floors were stone, cold underfoot, and the echoes of Eden's steps sounded wrong, like a stranger walking through a gallery after closing time. Art hung on the walls in careful symmetry, expensive pieces framed behind glass. None of it carried warmth. None of it looked like it had ever been chosen by someone in love with it. A housekeeper met him near the staircase. Her uniform was crisp, her hair pinned back, her face kind in a way that never crossed into familiarity. She introduced herself with a name Eden barely caught, then guided him forward with professional efficiency. Her voice stayed soft, but her instructions landed like rules, even when she tried to make them sound gentle. Medical check-ins at regular intervals, restricted areas, no unauthorized contact with staff, meals delivered on schedule, no visitors, no leaving the property without clearance, no photographs, no posts, no questions about the Alpha Guardian unless asked directly. Eden nodded, absorbing each condition like a new layer of skin tightening around him. At the doorway to the guest wing, she held out a small box and asked him to extend his wrist. The bracelet clicked into place, snug enough to be felt at all times, light enough to be forgotten until the moment you wanted to forget it. A sensor glowed briefly, then settled into a quiet pulse. Eden stared at it with a sick, familiar realization. It was the kind of controlled comfort that felt less like care and more like ownership. His room was larger than his entire old sublet, a bed made with stiff white linen, a bathroom with towels folded into perfect squares, a window overlooking a garden that looked untouched by weather. Even the air carried a faint scent of clean fabric and neutral soap. Eden set his suitcase on a bench and did not open it right away. He stood still, listening. The mansion held a particular kind of silence, not peaceful, monitored. Eden expected emptiness. He expected to move through hallways like a ghost, leaving no fingerprints on surfaces that seemed allergic to human life. He expected the Alpha Guardian to remain distant, appearing only for signatures and medical updates, a shadow whose presence mattered more than his voice. Instead, just as the housekeeper stepped away, Eden heard something that didn't belong in a museum. Footsteps running, small, fast, careless steps that struck the stone too loudly, followed by a sudden pause, as if the runner had remembered to be afraid. A breath held, a heartbeat in the hall. Eden turned before he could stop himself, his instincts sharpening. At the far end of the corridor stood 3 children arranged like a defensive line, 2 boys and a girl, all under 10, all dressed neatly in the way uniforms are neat, as if someone had prioritized appearance over comfort. Their faces were pale under the hallway lights, their eyes too watchful, too measured. Children who had learned early that adults could change moods without warning. The smallest one clutched a worn stuffed rabbit by one ear. The middle boy hovered a step behind her, chin lifted like he was trying to look braver than he felt. The oldest boy stood slightly forward, shoulders set, gaze sharp with the kind of protectiveness that usually belonged to grown-ups. They stared at Eden's wristband first, then at his suitcase, then at his scent, that soft omega warmth that never fully disappeared, no matter how carefully he controlled himself. Their expressions shifted, not into delight, not into playfulness, but into something hungry and tense, like people recognizing a lifeline they didn't trust enough to reach for. Eden's throat tightened. He didn't know what to do with children in a contract built for silence. The little girl took a half-step closer, her fingers whitening around the rabbit's ear. Her eyes flicked from Eden's face to his hands, as if checking whether he would push her away. The oldest boy's jaw clenched, as if preparing for rejection before it happened. Eden heard himself whisper, barely audible, "Hey, it's okay." The words sounded strange in the cold corridor, like warmth spoken into a room that didn't understand it, and then it happened. Not as a joke, not as a mistake, but as if naming him was an act of survival. As if the children had tried every other door in the house and finally decided to knock on the only one that felt human. The small voice, trembling but certain, gave him the title the contract had promised would never be his. Eden's body went still. His wristband pulsed against his skin. His mind reached for the contract, for the rules, for the safe distance he'd been promised. But the children didn't care about promises written on paper. They cared about whether someone would stay. Eden's mind tried to correct the moment the way it always corrected danger. It reached for the safest explanation first. A prank, confusion, some cruel game rich children played to entertain themselves in a house with too many rooms and too little love. He had seen children act out before. He had seen people use softness as bait. His body stayed braced, every muscle ready for the snap that followed kindness. But children who played jokes did not look like this. They did not hold themselves like they were rationing air. They did not watch an adult with the careful, trained caution of someone who had learned that the wrong expression could invite punishment. They did not say a word like it was a last chance. The youngest, the girl, stepped closer first. She held a stuffed rabbit by one ear, the fabric worn thin where someone had clutched it in the dark. The toy's button eye was missing, replaced by a crooked stitch. It looked repaired by small hands that had learned to fix what no one else bothered to fix. Her gaze stayed locked on Eden's face, unblinking, as if she believed he might vanish if she let herself blink. Eden felt it in his throat, a pressure that had nothing to do with scent or heat. He swallowed slowly, forcing his voice to stay gentle. "It's okay," he murmured, and the words came out rawer than he meant, like a confession. The eldest boy did not move. He stood a half-step forward, shoulders squared, chin lifted. He looked like a child who had been asked to become an adult too early. His eyes scanned Eden the way security scanned people at checkpoints, quick and thorough. Hands, belt, pockets, the bracelet, the suitcase, the seams of his clothing. A silent search for proof that this omega could hurt them. Eden's palms opened on instinct, empty and visible, as if to show he carried nothing dangerous. He hated that he knew the gesture so well. The middle boy hovered behind them, half hidden, as though he had learned that being unseen was safer than being wanted. He watched with quiet intensity, his attention sharp, but his body held back. He was the kind of child who had learned that asking for things only made the disappointment hurt more when the answer was no. Eden tried to reset the scene. He tried to become the person the contract required, neutral, professional, temporary. He had come here to carry a child that was not his. He had come here to follow rules, submit to monitoring, accept money, and then leave. He was not here to collect attachments like fragile glass. He was not here to become a substitute parent to children who belonged to someone else. He breathed in slowly, tasting the sterile air and the faint scent of polish from the floors. He reminded himself of the agency's words, alone, quiet, uncomplicated. He glanced down at his wristband. The soft pulse against his skin felt like a warning. Eden crouched anyway, not because he wanted to, but because towering over them felt wrong. He brought himself to their level, lowering his presence, making his body smaller in the way he had always done to survive. Yet this time the gesture did not make him invisible. It made him reachable. The girl's shoulders loosened by a fraction. Eden asked their names, careful and slow. He did not demand answers. He left room for refusal. The eldest boy hesitated as if he had been trained not to offer personal information. The middle boy watched his mouth, tracking tone more than words. The girl clutched the rabbit tighter, then whispered something that barely made it past her teeth, a name that sounded like it had not been used gently in a long time. Eden repeated it softly, not correcting, not teasing, just acknowledging. The girl's eyes shimmered, not with joy, but with that sudden pain children carry when something simple finally feels safe. The oldest boy gave his name next, stiffly, as if saying it might cost him. The middle boy said nothing at first. When Eden didn't push, when he simply waited, the boy's gaze flicked down and then back up. His voice arrived like an afterthought, quiet and careful, his name offered as if he expected it to be dropped. Eden nodded once, as if receiving something valuable. He felt the children listening to the shape of his attention, testing whether it would break. They asked him nothing about himself, not directly. Yet their eyes kept returning to him, to the omega scent that settled differently in the hallway than the sharp, controlled scents of adult alphas. Eden knew what they were smelling. Calm, warmth, the kind of presence that did not press, did not demand. Omega safe without trying to be. The girl touched his sleeve with 2 fingertips, a contact so light it could have been an accident. Eden went still, letting her decide. She withdrew a second later, as if startled by her own bravery, but she did not step away. That mattered. Footsteps sounded in the distance, and all 3 children stiffened at once. It was a full-body reaction, immediate and practiced. The eldest boy shifted subtly, putting himself between Eden and the direction of the steps. The girl's rabbit rose like a shield. The middle boy melted backward into the wall, eyes widening. Eden didn't ask why. He didn't force them to explain their fear. He simply stayed where he was, steady and low, as if he could be a buffer without needing to understand the whole war. The footsteps passed. A staff member, not the alpha. The children exhaled as if releasing breath they had been holding for years. Eden felt something crack inside him, not breaking, but opening. That evening he returned to the guest wing and unpacked slowly, placing his clothes into drawers that smelled of cedar and untouched fabric. The mansion's silence pressed on him again, but now it carried a different texture. He could hear distant movement, a door closing too gently, a whisper that cut off, the soft scuff of socks on stone floors, and then the smallest sound, unmistakable. 3 sets of footsteps following at a distance. Eden paused at his doorway, hand on the frame, spine tight with the instinct to shut himself away. The contract had promised solitude. The mansion had delivered something else. He had come here expecting control. Instead, he was being adopted, one fragile moment at a time, by children who had decided he was worth risking hope for. Callum Hale arrived after the house had settled into its evening quiet, the kind of quiet that wasn't restful but enforced. The staff moved differently when the message came through. Shoulders straightened, voices lowered, hallway lights were adjusted by a fraction, as if even brightness had to be curated before his presence entered the building. Eden noticed it before he saw him, The change in the air, the subtle tightening of scent from the people passing the corridor, alpha nerves masked under professional composure. It was not fear in the dramatic sense. It was something colder, conditioning. The security that accompanied Callum did not announce itself. No loud boots, no visible weapons, no obvious intimidation. It was the kind of protection that looked like ordinary men in ordinary suits, each of them positioned so naturally they seemed accidental. Eden recognized the geometry of it immediately. He had lived long enough to understand how power moved without raising its voice. When Callum finally stepped into the hall, Eden felt the space recalibrate around him, not with violence, with authority, the kind that made bodies obey before minds chose to. He was younger than Eden expected, but his eyes were older, the kind of tired that settled behind the pupils and stayed there, unmovable by money or rest. His hair was perfectly arranged, his shirt crisp, his suit fitted with the precision of someone whose image was part of his armor. He looked like a man built for rooms where people smiled while cutting each other to pieces. His scent was controlled, expensive, restrained, not comforting, not warm. It carried the faint bite of stress layered under cologne, like something that had been carefully sealed and was still trying to leak through. Callum's gaze landed on Eden with the professional assessment of a person reading a file in real time. It did not linger. It did not soften. It measured, categorized, and moved on, as if Eden were one more variable in a plan already drafted. The housekeeper introduced them. Eden stood with his hands loosely at his sides, posture steady by effort rather than ease. The bracelet on his wrist pulsed once, a quiet reminder that he was documented, monitored, tracked. Callum greeted him politely, efficiently. His voice carried the smoothness of practiced public speech, the kind that never gave away too much truth. He spoke about medical schedules, agency protocol, clinic appointments, nutrition plans. He mentioned confidentiality the way people mentioned weather, as if it were obvious and unavoidable. His attention stayed on the tablet in his hand, longer than it stayed on Eden's face. Eden answered in short phrases. He kept his tone neutral. He felt his body wanting to shrink, to become less visible, to avoid the risk of being judged wrong. He hated that instinct. He hated how quickly his nervous system recognized a powerful alpha and translated it into caution. At the edge of the corridor, near the staircase, the children hovered. They had been there since earlier, orbiting Eden like they were afraid he might dissolve if they let him out of sight. The moment Callum entered, all three froze, as if someone had snapped a wire inside them. The smallest girl clutched her rabbit tighter. The fabric compressed under her fingers until the toy looked like it couldn't breathe. Her eyes widened, and the fragile hope she had been carrying a few minutes earlier folded inward like paper in rain. The middle boy's shoulders tightened. His chin lifted just enough to pretend he wasn't afraid, but his breath grew shallow, controlled. He stared at the floor for a second, as if trying to make himself invisible by force of will. The eldest boy's jaw set like stone. His posture turned rigid, protective, but it wasn't the confident protectiveness of a child who trusted adults. It was the desperate stance of a child who had learned he was the only wall his siblings had. Callum barely glanced at them, not from cruelty, from absence, from the kind of emotional distance that became habit when love was treated like a liability and tenderness like a weakness that could be exploited. His eyes passed over the children the way they might pass over furniture in a familiar room, an acknowledgement of presence without engagement. The girl's face tightened. The middle boy swallowed hard. The eldest boy's eyes narrowed with something that looked like resentment and heartbreak wearing the same mask. Eden watched it happen in real time, the children's expressions shifting into that older, practiced flatness. Hope retracting, disappointment settling into them like a familiar coat they could put on without thinking. Something inside Eden reacted before he could stop it. A pulse of anger, not loud, not explosive, but sharp enough to sting behind his ribs. He had signed a contract expecting rules, control, quiet. He had prepared himself for being treated like a vessel. He had not prepared for the sight of children being treated like an inconvenience in their own home. A staff member tried to guide the kids away with a subtle gesture, and the eldest boy stiffened further, as if any movement might be interpreted as disobedience. Eden saw the calculation in his eyes. How to avoid punishment, how to keep his siblings safe, how to survive. Eden's throat tightened. He forced himself to breathe slowly, the way he had learned to do when panic threatened to bloom into scent. He reminded himself that he was a guest, that he had no authority here, that he could not afford to challenge Callum Hale, not with his own future still tied to this contract. But the words the children had spoken earlier still hovered in him like a bruise. Dad at Eden looked at Callum's tablet again, the neat rows of scheduling, the medical checkboxes, the list of protocols. He wondered, suddenly and painfully, if Callum knew their allergies, their nightmares. What made the youngest cry quietly at night? What made the middle boy stop eating when anxious? What made the eldest boy hold his breath when an adult walked into the room? He suspected he did not. For a brief moment, Callum's gaze flicked toward the children as they turned to go. Not enough to stop them, not enough to call their names. It was a look that carried faint irritation at a disruption, the way a busy man noticed a noise he didn't have time for. Eden heard himself think, simple and stunned. This house is not cold because it lacks warmth. It is cold because it has been taught to fear it, and in that realization, Eden understood what the contract had not warned him about. He had not just stepped into a controlled residence. He had stepped into a family shaped by absence, where 3 small lives had learned to survive without being wanted, and where an Omega's softness might be the most dangerous thing in the world, not because it harmed, but because it could change everything. The first week became a quiet war between schedules and reality. The mansion ran on routines the way hospitals ran on protocols. Breakfast arrived at the same hour each morning, plated with the same careful symmetry, as if food was a task rather than comfort. Lessons began on time with private tutors who spoke softly and smiled with practiced patience. Playtime was monitored and contained inside designated rooms, behind doors that closed with a gentle click that still sounded like a lock. Even the outdoor garden time followed a timeline, supervised from a distance by staff who never relaxed their posture. Each child had an individual timetable printed on crisp paper and clipped to a board in the staff corridor. Each child had an assigned caregiver whose job was to ensure compliance, not connection. Each child also had invisible boundaries that shaped the air around them, where they stood, how much space they allowed, when they flinched, what they hid. Eden saw those boundaries immediately because he recognized them. He had grown up inside boundaries that were never spoken but always enforced. At first, he tried to stay in his lane as the contract demanded. He focused on his health and the pregnancy requirements. He attended the daily check-ins with the clinic by video call. He submitted to weight monitoring, blood pressure readings, scent profiling. He swallowed supplements that tasted like chalk and drank water that arrived already measured in a glass with a lid. He followed the exercise restrictions and kept his movements slow and careful, as if his body belonged to a schedule rather than himself. The bracelet on his wrist became a second pulse. It blinked softly during certain hours, a reminder that even his rest was recorded. When he stood too long, a notification vibrated. When his heart rate rose, it noted the change with calm insistence. It didn't feel like protection. It felt like a leash made of data. Eden repeated his rules to himself every morning. Do not interfere, do not attach, do not become important, carry the child, leave cleanly. Still, the children kept finding him. They appeared in the corridor outside his guest wing, as if they had memorized the rhythm of his footsteps. They waited near his doorway in the mornings like they had been awake all night, listening for the moment he moved. They hovered in the kitchen area when he asked for tea, watching the way he held the cup, the way he rinsed it afterward, the way he said thank you to staff members who barely looked up. They did not demand attention. They simply existed near him, pulled into his gravity with an instinct that looked like hunger. Eden told himself it was because he was new, a novelty in a house where nothing changed. But he noticed the deeper pattern. When he entered a room, their shoulders lowered. When his voice softened, their breathing eased. When his scent settled into the air, warm and omega-safe, they stopped scanning the corners like prey. It unsettled him how quickly their bodies responded. Children should not be this desperate for calm. They called him Dad the way people used prayers, not playful, not casual, like a word that might hold them together if they spoke it often enough. At first, Eden corrected it only in his head. He told himself it was a mistake that would fix itself. He told himself the children were confused and he had no right to encourage it. He told himself Callum Hale would notice and redirect them, because surely a father would not allow his children to latch onto a surrogate like this. But Callum remained a distant orbit. He passed through hallways with phone calls in his ear and documents in his hand. He attended medical updates. He approved budgets. He did not sit on the floor with his children. He did not ask them what they dreamed about. He did not notice the way the youngest girl held her rabbit like a flotation device. Eden watched the staff manage the children with polite efficiency. They reminded them to wash hands. They corrected posture. They enforced bedtimes. They never asked, "Are you okay?" They never waited long enough to hear the truth if the child tried to answer. The cracked foundation revealed itself in small, sharp moments. The eldest boy refused a snack, even though his stomach growled, pride winning over need. The middle boy stared at his tutor's worksheet with empty eyes until the teacher praised him, and then he worked like someone fearing punishment. The youngest girl tucked herself into corners with her rabbit, silent, watching adult faces the way people watch skies before storms. Eden did not step in, not at first. He stayed careful, he stayed quiet. He stayed where the contract placed him. Then the night came that broke the illusion of distance. It was late, deep into the hours when a mansion should have felt secure. The corridors were dim, the air chilled by climate control, the silence thick enough to press against skin. Eden lay awake because pregnancy had turned sleep into a fragile thing. His body shifted, uncomfortable, and the bracelet on his wrist pulsed once, registering movement. That was when he heard it. A small sound behind a door down the hall, not loud enough to alert staff, not dramatic enough to trigger an emergency. It was the kind of sound children learned to make when they believed no one would come. Muffled crying. Eden sat up in bed, heart immediately racing, every old instinct screaming at him to stay out of it. Crossing boundaries had always been dangerous. Getting involved had always led to consequences. He stared at the ceiling and tried to ignore it. The crying continued, soft and strained, as if the child were pressing her face into a pillow to keep the sound from traveling. Eden swung his legs off the bed before he fully decided to. The floor was cold under his feet. The hallway light turned on automatically as he stepped out, and the bracelet blinked against his skin, a quiet reminder that his movements were being recorded. He walked slowly, each step measured. The crying stopped for a second, then resumed, smaller, like it was trying to hide. Eden stood outside the door and felt his hands clench. He could leave. He could go back to bed and let the routine handle it in the morning. He could pretend he had heard nothing. His throat tightened and he whispered, barely audible, "I'm here." No reply came, only another shaky breath. Eden did not touch the handle. He did not enter. He did not break the rules in a way that could be called interference. He slid down the wall and sat on the floor outside the door, knees drawn up, palms resting on his thighs. He made himself a presence rather than an intrusion. Minutes passed. The crying softened, then stopped. The silence that followed was different, not empty. Settled, Eden stayed there anyway, listening for the return of fear. Behind the door, a small shift of fabric sounded, as if the child had moved closer. Then another sound, barely there, like relief escaping through a tiny crack. Eden exhaled slowly. His chest ached with something he did not have language for. He had come here expecting control and solitude. He had prepared himself to be managed like a body on a timetable. Instead, the first week had revealed a truth the contract had never mentioned. This mansion did not lack structure. It lacked someone who would stay outside a child's door in the dark and mean it when he thought, "You are not alone." The agency had assured Eden that the surrogacy process would be clinical, controlled, and emotionally sterile. The embryo had been created from Callum's genetics and an anonymous donor, implanted with precision, monitored through numbers and protected by paperwork. Everything had been presented as clean and manageable, a transaction with a timeline, but pregnancy was never sterile. It was sensory, it was messy. It rewired the body from the inside out, no matter how carefully adults tried to frame it as logistics. Eden began to feel the early signals in quiet increments. The heaviness came first, subtle at dawn, like gravity had decided to claim more of him. The nausea followed in waves that did not ask permission, turning ordinary smells into threats. The scent of coffee in the kitchen made his stomach clench. The polished wood in the corridor carried a faint chemical note that suddenly felt sharp enough to cut. Then came the instincts, the strange protective impulses that rose like tides. Eden noticed how his eyes tracked the exits without thinking, how his hands drifted to his stomach when footsteps moved too quickly behind him, how his body softened and tensed around imagined danger, as if something inside him had been appointed guardian without being consulted. The staff responded with routine efficiency. They adjusted his meals. They replaced foods that triggered nausea with bland, safe options. They scheduled more frequent vitals checks. They recorded changes in a digital file, neatly categorized, and moved on. Their care was competent, but it was not personal. They treated the pregnancy like a project under surveillance. The children noticed the difference before anyone spoke it aloud. Children noticed what adults pretended was not there. They sensed shifts the way animals sensed weather. Eden's scent changed first, the faint sweetness of omega biology mixing with the deeper warmth of pregnancy. It settled into rooms like a soft blanket, different from perfume, different from detergent, unmistakably alive. The middle boy began bringing Eden water without being asked. It started as a glass left on the table near Eden's chair, placed carefully, then abandoned as if it had appeared by accident. When Eden looked up to acknowledge it, the boy was already retreating, face neutral, pretending he had done nothing. The youngest girl began pressing her rabbit against Eden's stomach when she thought no one was watching, as if introducing the toy to the life growing there. She did it gently, with the reverence of a child who believed objects could carry prayers. Her eyes would search Eden's face afterward, checking for rejection. When Eden did not pull away, she would exhale, as if she'd been holding her breath for years. The eldest boy watched everything with narrowed eyes, calculating. He measured Eden's reactions, his energy, his steadiness. He studied the way Eden moved more slowly now, the way he sometimes paused in the corridor as if waiting for his body to catch up with his intentions. The boy looked like someone trying to predict the future, because in his world the future had always been another word for loss. Eden tried to remain an outsider. He reminded himself each morning that this pregnancy belonged to the contract, that the child inside him would not be his, that closeness to anyone in this house was a risk. He failed anyway, in small and inevitable ways. It started with food. One evening he noticed the middle boy pushing peas around his plate, not eating, eyes fixed somewhere far away. A caregiver gave a polite instruction, then returned to her tablet. The boy's hand kept moving in circles, the food untouched. Eden watched for a long moment, then asked quietly if the meal was cold. The boy did not answer, but the smallest tremor in his shoulders said, yes. Eden took the plate to the kitchen without asking permission, warmed it until steam rose, and brought it back. He did not make a speech about nutrition. He simply set it down. The boy stared at it as if it might vanish. Then he ate, fast and silent, like someone afraid the chance would be taken away. Another night, Eden found the youngest girl asleep at the top of the stairs, rabbit tucked under her chin, the mansion's lights dimming around her. No caregiver was in sight. Eden stood there with his heart tightening, the bracelet blinking faintly against his wrist, as if recording the fact that he had stopped moving. He could have called staff. He could have left her where she lay, trusting the system to correct itself. Instead, he lifted her carefully, her small body warm and weightless. She made a soft sound in her sleep and curled closer automatically, as if her nervous system recognized safety before consciousness did. Eden carried her to her room and placed her in bed, pulling the blanket up to her shoulders. As he turned to leave, he found the eldest boy in the doorway, watching. The child's face was unreadable, but his eyes were too bright. Eden felt something shift in his own chest. I'm not stealing anyone, Eden whispered, more to himself than to the child. I'm just here. The eldest boy did not respond, but he did not step away either. He stood in the doorway like a guard, and when Eden passed, the boy moved aside with reluctant permission. Callum remained focused on logistics. He attended medical updates, he signed invoices, he ensured security protocols were followed. He asked questions about risk factors and timelines. He checked his messages during clinic calls. He spoke in the language of control because it was the only language he trusted, but he did not ask Eden how he was sleeping. He did not ask whether Eden's nausea had eased. He did not ask why the middle boy had started hovering near Eden's wing more often, or why the youngest girl's rabbit kept appearing on Eden's couch like an offering. He did not ask the children how they were coping with the fact that a new adult had entered their house and quietly begun doing the things no one else did. Eden began to understand, slowly and painfully, that this pregnancy was not the only life being carried in the mansion. There were 3 children carrying years of emotional neglect, carrying the weight of being managed instead of loved. No one had labeled it an emergency because it did not show up on a monitor. There was no bracelet blinking for them, no staff meeting about their rising stress levels, no chart that tracked their loneliness. The children did not need grand gestures. They did not need gifts or speeches or perfect photographs. They needed consistency. They needed a voice that stayed soft even when rules demanded distance. They needed a presence that did not disappear after the first mistake. And Eden, who had never been given consistency himself, started building it anyway. One warmed plate, one blanket, one glass of water at a time, while his own body quietly reshaped itself around the life growing inside him. The turning point arrived in public, the way shame always liked to arrive, wearing expensive perfume and smiling for cameras. Callum hosted a philanthropic event on the estate, the kind that looked generous from a distance and strategic up close. Invitations went to donors, board members, journalists who owed favors, and photographers who knew how to crop reality into something clean. The staff treated the day like a military operation. Furniture was repositioned. Glassware was polished until it looked invisible. Flowers were arranged to appear effortless. Security lines were redrawn with subtle precision. Eden was briefed early that morning. The message came through staff, not directly from Callum, but it carried his weight. Discretion, no appearances, no hallway crossings, no accidental proximity to guests. The agency's rules sat behind every instruction like a threat: confidentiality, image control, containment. Eden nodded and agreed. He told himself it did not matter. He told himself he was temporary. Still, his stomach tightened in a way that had nothing to do with pregnancy. Something about a celebration in a house that felt like a museum made his skin prickle. It wasn't joy that filled the air. It was performance. The children were prepared like props. Their hair was combed into neat lines too tight at the scalp. Their clothes were chosen to match each other without looking identical, curated cohesion for a camera lens. Their shoes were polished. Their faces were cleaned. Their expressions were coached by caregivers who spoke in calm tones that left no room for refusal. Eden saw them briefly in the corridor before staff moved them away. The youngest girl clutched her rabbit behind her back as if hiding it was part of the dress code. The middle boy's eyes were glassy with the effort of obedience. The eldest boy wore a practiced stillness, jaw tight, shoulders set, as if he had already decided that surviving the day meant feeling nothing. They looked smaller than usual in their formal clothes, like children dressed for someone else's life. Callum appeared in the main hall an hour before the first guests, flawless in a tailored suit, moving with the calm authority that made adults step aside without being told. He checked schedules, exchanged quiet words with staff, scanned the room like a strategist. His scent stayed controlled, expensive, restrained. The children were positioned beside him as the first arrivals entered, not held, not embraced, simply placed in frame. Callum stood behind them, one hand resting lightly on the eldest boy's shoulder for photographs, the kind of touch that signaled ownership more than affection. The kids held still. Their smiles came out thin, practiced, ready to collapse the moment the shutter stopped clicking. Eden was kept in the guest wing, instructed to remain out of sight. The doors between his corridor and the main hall were closed. A staff member hovered nearby under the excuse of checking on his comfort, but Eden recognized the real purpose: containment. He tried to distract himself. He drank water. He ate a bland snack because the nurse insisted. He pressed a palm to his stomach when the baby shifted, as if seeking reassurance. Through the walls he could hear the faint murmur of voices, laughter that rose and fell on cue, and the constant soft click of camera shutters like insects. At some point, he needed to move. Not to intervene, not to disobey, but to breathe. The guest wing felt too tight, the air too filtered. He stepped into a side hallway that overlooked the main corridor through a partial opening, intending to stand there for a moment and then return before anyone noticed. That was when the youngest saw him. It happened in a heartbeat. Her head turned sharply as if her body recognized him before her eyes confirmed it. The rabbit slipped from behind her back and fell against her leg. Her face changed, the thin camera smile collapsing into something raw and immediate, relief and hunger and fear all at once. Then she broke formation. She ran. Small shoes slipped on polished stone, the sound too loud in the quiet luxury of the hall. A caregiver reached for her and missed. The girl moved like someone escaping restraint, arms outstretched, breath quick, a child sprinting toward the only warmth she trusted. The room froze. Photographers snapped their heads toward the movement. Donors paused mid-sip of champagne. Conversations thinned into silence. Callum's posture tightened, a precise shift in his shoulders that signaled alarm. The child reached Eden and clung to his leg as if she'd been holding her breath all day. Her small fingers gripped fabric with desperate certainty. Eden felt the tremor in her arms, the frantic need to anchor herself to something real. Eden's entire body went still. His wristband blinked once, recording the spike in his heart rate. He could feel dozens of eyes pinning him in place, assessing, judging, turning him into a question. The girl tilted her face up, eyes bright with that dangerous kind of trust children give when they have nothing else left. "Dad," she said, clear and loud. The word rang through the hall like a dropped glass. The perfect image cracked. Callum's face remained composed, but his scent shifted, sharp and alarmed, the controlled alpha edge flaring for a brief second before he forced it back down. He stepped forward quickly, mouth ready with something polished, something that could be explained away. A staff member moved as if to lift the child off Eden's leg. Another reached for Eden's elbow to pull him back into the guest wing. The middle boy stood frozen near the staircase, eyes wide. The eldest boy's jaw tightened further, his gaze darting between Eden and Callum like he was watching a fight he couldn't stop. Eden felt the pressure of it all. The cameras, the curiosity, the implication. He felt the children's fears spike like a wave, not just the girl clinging to him, but the others too. Fear that the moment would be punished, fear that Eden would be taken away for causing trouble, fear that they had made a mistake by hoping. And in that instant, Eden did the only thing that made their shoulders drop. He knelt, not dramatically, not for attention. He simply lowered himself until he was at the child's level, making his body smaller instead of trying to dominate the space. He placed a hand gently on her back, a steady pressure that communicated one thing. "You are safe right now." He breathed out slowly, regulating himself on purpose, letting his scent soften instead of sharpening under stress. "It's okay," he whispered, the words barely audible, but the child heard them anyway. The girl's grip loosened by a fraction. Her breathing steadied. Eden did not look at the cameras. He did not glance around for approval. He did not flinch when the staff hovered, unsure whether to intervene. He stayed where he was, hand on the child's back, head bowed slightly, as if shielding her from the weight of adult eyes. It was not rebellion. It was not romance. It was protection, and it turned the mansion's quiet emotional neglect into a visible scandal, because the moment revealed something that no amount of curated philanthropy could hide. A father on paper stood upright in a perfect suit, while a father in real time knelt on cold stone to keep a child from breaking in front of strangers. In the silence that followed, Eden felt the smallest shift inside the hall, like the estate itself had inhaled and realized it had been caught telling the wrong story. After the guests left, the mansion felt like it had been stripped down to its bones. The music stopped first, leaving behind an emptiness that made every small sound feel too loud. Glasses clinked as staff cleared tables. The last laughter faded into the driveway as cars disappeared through the gates. The lights that had been turned brighter for cameras softened again, returning the house to its usual controlled dimness. What remained was not peace. It was aftermath. Callum's staff moved in silence, efficient and tense, like people cleaning a crime scene without admitting it had happened. Security officers spoke into earpieces with restrained urgency, reviewing footage, pausing frames, rewinding the moment the youngest girl broke formation and ran. The caregivers avoided Eden's corridor entirely, as if his presence had become a contaminant. The agency called within the hour. The voice on the line was polite, smooth, and panicked in a way that had been trained to sound professional. Eden heard his own name spoken with careful precision, as if even syllables could be a liability. He was reminded of confidentiality. He was reminded of public exposure risk. He was reminded of the moral hazard of emotional attachment. Clauses were quoted as if they were prayers. Consequences were implied without being named. Eden listened with his jaw clenched, fingers pressed to the inside of his palm. His wristband blinked once, registering elevated stress. He felt nausea rise, not from pregnancy this time, but from the way the world tried to reduce children's desperation to a contract breach. When the call ended, the house remained quiet for several minutes, as if waiting for the next move. The summons came without drama. A staff member appeared at Eden's door, expression neutral, voice soft. Callum Hale would like to see him in his office. Now, Eden's body reacted before his mind did. A tightness in the spine, a familiar readiness for punishment. He stood slowly, hand resting against his stomach for a moment, grounding himself. He followed the staff member through corridors that felt longer than usual, the walls too clean, the air too filtered. Callum's office was a room built for control. Dark wood, minimal decoration, a view that looked out over the estate like the house was something to be managed rather than lived in. A single lamp cast a precise pool of light over paperwork that had already been arranged. A tablet sat beside a folder with Eden's name. Callum did not ask him to sit. He did not offer tea. He greeted him with courtesy that felt like distance disguised as manners. The conversation was not a dialogue. It was an arrangement presented as the only reasonable option. Callum spoke about the event as if it had been an operational failure. He used words like exposure, optics, liability. He referred to the child's reaction as unfortunate, not because he disliked her, but because he disliked what her need had revealed. He noted that emotional attachment could complicate custody narratives in the future. He stated that it could destabilize the surrogacy agreement and invite scrutiny from people who enjoyed tearing down powerful men for sport. Eden stood still and listened. His heartbeat hammered against his ribs, loud in his own ears. His stomach felt heavy, but he could not tell where pregnancy ended and dread began. Callum presented a plan. Eden would remain in the guest wing, strictly separated. The children would be redirected to their caregivers. The staff would enforce boundaries more aggressively. Access points between wings would be locked. Eden would attend medical appointments and required movement only on schedule. The rest of the time he would be out of sight. If Eden complied, compensation would increase. The money was mentioned in the same tone as the rest, as if it were simply another variable, not a gift, not gratitude, a lever, money offered as anesthesia. Eden's mind flickered through practical images with brutal clarity. His debt wiped clean. A new apartment in a safer neighborhood. A future where he did not have to ration suppressants. A life where he could stop bracing for disaster every day. Survival screamed at him to say yes. He felt the word forming in the back of his throat. He felt himself about to accept the deal the way he had accepted every deal that promised stability at the cost of his own tenderness. Then, his thoughts snapped to the children. The youngest girl clinging to his leg in front of strangers, shaking as if she had been holding herself together all day. The middle boy leaving water near Eden's chair, pretending it was nothing because wanting things openly hurt too much. The eldest boy standing like a shield, eyes older than his face, carrying the weight of everyone else's fear. Eden's chest tightened. He understood what separation would mean for them. Not just disappointment, confirmation, another adult choosing convenience over them, another door closing, another lesson that attachment was a mistake. Eden's voice came out low and rough, the smallest crack in his composure. "They're not a problem to be managed," he said, and the words sounded dangerous in that room. Callum's eyes sharpened for a second. His scent cooled, controlled, edged, but he kept his voice polite, as if courtesy could soften an ultimatum. He reiterated the plan. He framed it as protection, for the children, for the pregnancy, for the family's privacy. He spoke as if boundaries were kindness, and distance was safety. Eden nodded once, not agreeing, not refusing, just absorbing the weight of what was being demanded. He did not argue further. He knew what power did when challenged directly. He knew how to survive rooms like this. When Callum dismissed him, Eden left with measured steps, hands steady by force. He walked through the corridor back toward the guest wing, the mansion quiet again, the kind of quiet that followed threat. Halfway down the hall, he saw the eldest boy waiting. The child stood near a doorway as if he had been placed there by instinct, not instruction. His posture was rigid, shoulders squared, expression flat with resignation that did not belong to a child. His eyes locked onto Eden's face and did not soften. He did not ask for anything. He did not need to. The message was in his stillness. Do not become another adult who chooses comfort over us. Eden stopped. For a moment the corridor felt too narrow to breathe in. His wristband pulsed against his skin, recording the spike of emotion he tried to swallow. The boy's gaze flicked briefly to Eden's stomach, then back up, as if calculating how many people would be abandoned in one decision. Eden could not speak. If he did, his voice would break. He took one slow breath and continued walking, not because he agreed with Callum, but because he needed to get out of the corridor before he did something irreversible. Back in his room, Eden shut the door and leaned his forehead against it for a long time. The mansion's silence pressed in from every side. He sat on the edge of the bed with his hands clenched, staring at nothing. The contract filled his mind like a cage. Clean clauses, smooth penalties, clear expectations, but the children's need had never fit on paper. For the first time, Eden wondered if leaving after the birth was even possible without destroying the fragile hope those children had already attached to him. And he wondered, with a sickening clarity, whether the real cost of this contract was not his body, but his ability to walk away from a family that had already started calling him by a name he had never been allowed to keep. The house confessed its truth the way houses always did, through what happened after midnight, when no cameras watched and no schedules protected anyone. Eden slept lightly in the mansion, not because the bed was uncomfortable, but because comfort had never been what made him feel safe. The mattress was too perfect, the silence too controlled, and his body, already changing with pregnancy, refused deep rest. He drifted in and out of sleep with one hand near his stomach, as if he could guard what was growing there by touch alone. A sound pulled him fully awake, small footsteps, careful but urgent, and the soft click of a door opening too quietly, the kind of quiet that belonged to children who had learned not to be noticed. Eden sat up, heart already racing. The bracelet on his wrist blinked once, registering the spike. For a moment he couldn't place the source of the sound, and that uncertainty made his skin prickle. Then, the youngest girl appeared at the edge of his doorway. Her hair was messy, her pajamas slightly twisted as if she had run out of bed without thinking. She held her rabbit in both hands like a talisman. Her eyes were wide, glassy with fear, and her whole body trembled as if she had stepped out of a nightmare and could not tell whether she was still inside it. Behind her, the middle boy hovered in the hallway, holding a blanket like a shield. He looked pale, mouth tight, eyes darting in quick, panicked checks down the corridor. He was trying to be brave, but his breathing was shallow and fast, as if he had been running from something invisible. The eldest boy stood farther back, just beyond the pool of light spilling from Eden's room. He did not step inside. Pride held him upright like a rigid spine. His arms were crossed, but not in defiance, in containment. His gaze stayed fixed on Eden with an intensity that looked almost angry, as if he hated himself for needing this. Something had happened. Eden swung his legs over the side of the bed, moving slowly because pregnancy made even quick movements feel wrong. He kept his voice low, steady, the way he had learned to do when calming animals and children alike. "I'm here," he murmured, and the words came out like a promise he hadn't meant to make. The youngest girl made a sound that was half breath and half sob. She didn't run to him the way she had in the daytime. She stood frozen, as if she didn't trust daylight rules to apply after midnight. The middle boy's fingers tightened around the blanket. The eldest boy's jaw clenched, as if he were preparing for Eden to refuse. Eden stepped into the hallway. The air felt colder at night, the mansion's climate control settling into its quiet, indifferent rhythm. The corridor lights were dimmed, motion sensors waking patches of brightness in small bursts as Eden moved. The bracelet blinked softly, recording every step. Somewhere beyond the walls, security systems hummed, unseen and vigilant. The children led him back toward their wing, not running now, but moving with a desperate caution. Eden followed, listening for adult footsteps, for a caregiver's voice, for any sign that the system had noticed the children were out of bed. There was none. When they reached the children's corridor, Eden understood immediately why their fear felt so raw. A door that should have been closed was ajar. A nightlight cast a thin glow into the room like a warning. The air inside smelled faintly of lavender detergent and something sharper underneath, the metallic edge of panic. Eden stepped in and looked around. The room where a caregiver had been assigned was empty. The chair by the wall sat untouched, as if no one had ever sat there. A book lay open on the side table, pages unturned. A mug of tea had gone cold, abandoned. The children's beds were rumpled in the way beds looked when someone had climbed out fast, but the blankets were not thrown back dramatically. It was the quiet kind of leaving that happened when children were used to moving without being heard. The house's polished safety had failed in the simplest way possible. It had left them alone. Eden felt something twist in his chest, hot and immediate, an anger he rarely allowed himself to feel. This mansion had security cameras and iron gates and staff on schedules. It could keep strangers out, but it could not keep a promise to 3 children who only needed one person awake in the dark. The youngest girl's breathing hitched. Her eyes darted to the empty chair, then to Eden, then back again, as if she couldn't understand how adults could vanish so easily. The middle boy's lips trembled, and he pressed the blanket against his chest like armor. The eldest boy stayed standing near the doorway, refusing to show fear, but his eyes were too bright. Eden crouched, then lowered himself fully to the floor, back against the wall. He made the room smaller with his presence, less like a museum and more like a place where a child could exist without performing. He patted the floor beside him once. A simple invitation. The youngest girl moved first, crawling into the space near Eden's shoulder and clutching her rabbit against her chest. The middle boy followed, sliding down with stiff movements, still holding the blanket as if he might need to hide under it. He sat close enough that Eden could feel the heat of him, but not close enough to admit he wanted it. The eldest boy hesitated. His pride fought his need like a visible battle. Then, slowly, as if surrendering to something he hated, he sat down too. Not leaning, not curling, but close enough that he was inside Eden's radius of calm. Eden breathed slowly on purpose. He had learned long ago that calm was not an emotion, it was a skill. He made his chest rise and fall in steady rhythm, letting his scent soften into the room instead of sharpening under stress. He kept his voice low. "You're safe," he whispered, and the words were not a strategy. They were truth he was choosing to create. The children leaned into him without asking permission, as if their bodies had decided he was the anchor long before their minds could justify it. The youngest girl's head rested against his upper arm. The middle boy's shoulder brushed his side. Even the eldest boy's rigid posture eased by a fraction, the tension in his spine loosening as if he could finally release the burden of staying alert. In that stillness, Eden felt something in his own chest shift. He had been raised to believe Omega's softness was a weakness that invited exploitation. He had been taught that being gentle made you useful to predators, that being needed was dangerous because it could be used against you. But here, in the dark, softness became something else entirely. It became the only thing keeping 3 children from falling apart. Minutes passed, then more. The room quiet except for slow breathing and the faint hum of the mansion's systems. Eden didn't move. He didn't check his phone. He didn't try to solve the problem with logic. He simply stayed, letting the children's nervous systems borrow his steadiness. Then a sound cut through the quiet. Footsteps in the hallway, heavier, adult-controlled. The motion sensor lights brightened in segments, waking up as someone approached. Eden's bracelet blinked again, responding to the change in his heart rate. Callum appeared at the end of the corridor. He had been drawn by the security alert triggered by the door, the kind of alert that mattered only when property boundaries were breached. He moved quickly, but not noisily, still wearing that controlled presence even in the middle of the night. He stopped when he reached the doorway. For a moment, he froze. His children were on the floor, curled against the Omega he had hired as a surrogate. The youngest girl clung to her rabbit and Eden's arm at the same time. The middle boy's blanket was half draped over Eden's leg. The eldest boy sat close enough to be protected without admitting it. Callum's face did not change much. His expression remained composed, a mask built over years. But his eyes did. Something in them shifted from irritation to shock, from management to recognition. He looked at the empty caregiver chair. He looked at the cold mug. He looked at the children who had not called for him, because calling for him had never been their instinct. Then his gaze returned to Eden. For the first time, he did not look at him as a contract. He looked at him as a person holding the pieces of his family together. Callum's voice came out quiet, stripped of public polish. "What happened?" he asked, and it sounded less like a demand and more like a confession that he did not know. Eden did not answer with blame. He simply lifted his eyes and let the truth sit between them, heavy and undeniable. "They were alone," he said softly, "and they shouldn't have been." The mansion remained silent around them, beautiful and useless in the way expensive things could be. And in that silence, Callum finally saw the crack in his foundation, not in stone or wood, but in 3 small hearts that had learned to survive without expecting anyone to come. The days after the midnight incident forced practical decisions the way storms forced people to shore up windows. There was no room left for pretending the system was working. The agency demanded adherence to protocols with voices that stayed polite while tightening the leash. They sent updated guidelines, reminders about emotional boundaries, clauses about risk management. Their words were calm, but the message was sharp. Control the narrative, control the attachment, control the surrogate. They spoke as if children's fear could be corrected with paperwork. Callum demanded discretion with the same instinct he used to protect his companies. No leaks, no staff gossip, no public hints that anything inside the mansion was unstable. He increased security shifts, limited staff movement between wings, installed additional interior checks that made the house feel even more like a guarded facility. The children demanded something they had never demanded before: honesty. Not the kind of honesty adults performed in interviews, but the kind that answered a child's simple, terrifying question. "Are you leaving?" They asked it without always using words. The youngest girl stopped letting caregivers tuck her in. The middle boy began tracking Eden's footsteps with his eyes, scanning for any sign of a suitcase. The eldest boy grew sharper, more watchful, as if he could prevent abandonment by anticipating it first. Eden felt the pressure of their need in his bones. He felt it each time his bracelet vibrated with a reminder that his body belonged to the contract. He felt it when the agency's emails arrived with sterile warnings, and when Callum's staff watched him with renewed caution, as if he might be contagious. Callum agreed to family therapy not because he believed in it, but because the alternative was collapse. He chose a therapist who specialized in adoption trauma and non-traditional family structures, someone whose reputation suggested she would not be intimidated by money, status, or the polished tone Callum used to end conversations. The appointment was made quietly, routed through assistants, framed as a private consultation. The first session took place off the estate, in a neutral office that smelled of tea and paper rather than polish and control. The room was warm in a way the mansion never was. There were soft chairs, a low table, and small objects meant for grounding. A bowl of smooth stones, a box of colored pencils, a stack of simple cards with emotions printed in plain words. Callum walked in like a man entering negotiations. His posture was composed, his suit perfect, his expression unreadable. Eden arrived a half-step behind, hands clasped, heart already tight, his body alert in the way it always became when authority and judgment were possible. The children followed with stiff reluctance, eyes scanning the room for exits and traps. The therapist did not compliment Callum's success. She did not soften her tone for his power. She introduced herself simply and spoke to the children first, acknowledging their presence as the point of the room rather than decoration. That alone shifted something. The youngest girl stared as if she had never been addressed like that before. The middle boy's shoulders loosened by a fraction. The eldest boy stayed rigid, but his eyes sharpened with reluctant attention. The sessions were brutal in their quietness. There were no dramatic revelations at first. There was just space where silence could no longer hide. The therapist asked Callum to describe his children without using their ages or their public image. She asked what foods they liked, what calmed them, what scared them. Callum answered with facts that sounded safe: school plans, medical histories, schedules. When pressed gently for what each child feared at night, he hesitated long enough that the room changed. He could name charitable foundations more easily than he could name his children's nightmares. The therapist did not accuse him. She simply let the truth sit there, heavy and plain. Callum's jaw tightened. His eyes flicked toward the children as if seeing them not as a responsibility, but as a reality he had failed to understand. Eden watched Callum's control strain. It did not break into anger. It cracked into something quieter, something more dangerous to a powerful alpha than rage: inadequacy. The therapist turned to Eden next, not as a vessel, not as an accessory, but as a person. She asked him what he did when he felt unsafe. Eden's mouth went dry. The answer lived in his muscle memory. He minimized. He complied. He anticipated punishment before it arrived. He heard himself say, soft and honest, "I try to be useful." The words tasted like a wound. Eden was confronted with his own patterns in a way he could not escape. The way he apologized for taking space. The way he checked other people's moods before speaking. The way he accepted discomfort as normal, because demanding care felt like arrogance. The way he treated himself like a temporary object, even in rooms where no one had explicitly asked him to. The children were confronted with something harder than any rule: the fact that attachment was terrifying when you had been abandoned repeatedly. That calling someone dad was a gamble when you did not believe adults stayed. The therapist gave them language for what they were already living. She explained gently that their bodies were trained to expect loss, that their nervous systems treated closeness like a cliff edge, that the youngest clung because she believed she had to, the middle boy watched because hope made him anxious, and the eldest acted older because someone had taught him that being a child was unsafe. At one point, the eldest boy's composure slipped just enough for a single sentence to escape him, flat and fierce. "Adults leave," he said. "So I don't." The room went still. Callum's face did not change much, but something behind his eyes shifted. Eden felt his throat tighten with the weight of it. The therapist did not offer a magical solution. She offered a map: slow integration, consistent presence, controlled transitions. She explained that the children could learn to bond to Callum safely, but only if the process did not involve ripping Eden out like a bandage. She recommended a structured plan: Callum practicing bedtime routines with Eden nearby at first, then gradually taking more responsibility while Eden remained a stable anchor in the room. Short separations that ended with predictable reunions. Clear explanations given in simple language. No sudden disappearances. No punishment for needing reassurance. Callum listened with the focus he reserved for high-stakes strategy, but the therapist's approach demanded something his world rarely demanded of him: patience without control. Then, pregnancy complicated everything further. As the weeks passed, Eden's body began showing signs of strain: blood pressure spikes during stressful days, insomnia that turned nights into long, wired stretches of listening to the mansion breathe, hormonal volatility that sharpened his instincts into panic, making him hyper-aware of every raised voice, every slammed door, every abrupt movement. The baby inside him responded to the emotional climate. Eden noticed it in the subtle shifts: the way the baby seemed calmer when the children laughed quietly in the guest wing, the way movement grew frantic when the house felt tense, when Callum's scent turned sharp, when the agency called, when the air tasted like conflict. Eden's bracelet recorded it all: numbers rising and falling, alerts that sounded like polite warnings, the body refusing to cooperate with denial. The therapist pointed it out without drama. Stress was not just an emotional inconvenience, it was a physical environment the baby was being built inside. The mansion was not only raising 3 children, it was building the world a 4th would be born into, and in that realization, the limits of control became painfully clear. Callum could lock gates, manage staff, and silence rumors, but he could not negotiate with the nervous system. He could not order trust into existence. He could not purchase a child's sense of safety. The only way forward required something the mansion had never been designed to hold: consistency that meant staying even when it was uncomfortable, truth that meant admitting failure without collapsing under it, and a kind of love that did not fit inside any contract clause, no matter how carefully it was written. The birth came early, as if Eden's body refused to wait for paperwork to catch up with reality. It started as a dull tightening low in his abdomen, the kind that could be dismissed if he wanted to pretend his life was still under control. Eden tried to breathe through it, tried to lie still, tried to convince himself it was nothing more than another wave of pregnancy discomfort. The mansion around him remained quiet, climate-controlled, orderly. His bracelet pulsed once, then again, and the notifications that followed were too calm for the panic they carried. Contractions, pattern detected, elevated stress. Medical protocol initiated. Eden sat up slowly, palm flattening against his stomach as if he could steady the baby with pressure. Another wave arrived, sharper, stealing air from his lungs. His mouth went dry. The room felt suddenly too bright, too clean, too far from anything human. He had been told the timeline would be predictable. His body had disagreed. Within minutes, the mansion switched from curated silence to controlled emergency. A night nurse appeared first, hair pinned back, voice steady. Then a second staff member, then security moving like a practiced machine. Hallway lights brightened in segments. Doors that were usually closed opened without hesitation. Radios whispered in clipped codes. The house did not comfort him, but it did respond, efficient in the way institutions responded to crisis. Eden was guided into a wheelchair, even though he insisted he could walk. Someone checked his blood pressure, then checked it again. Someone asked him to rate the pain, but numbers felt useless when his body was splitting open from the inside. He heard himself whisper, "Too soon," and the words sounded like prayer and accusation at the same time. The children appeared at the end of the corridor, drawn by the disruption the way they were drawn to every crack in the mansion's calm. The youngest girl clutched her rabbit and stared with wet eyes. The middle boy held the edge of a doorway as if trying to keep the world from shifting. The eldest boy stood rigid, face pale, jaw set in that familiar determination to not fall apart first. Eden's chest tightened harder than the contractions. He could not explain. He could not promise. He could only meet their eyes for a brief second and try to pour steadiness into that look. The youngest made a small sound, a fractured inhale, and Eden felt his own throat burn. A paramedic team arrived through a side entrance. Security cleared corridors for them as if time could be controlled by opening doors faster. The ambulance lights cast faint reflections against the estate's windows, brief flashes of blue and white sliding across glass like ghosts. Callum appeared near the foyer, dressed in a shirt thrown on too quickly, no tie, no polished armor. His face was composed by habit, but his eyes were sharp with something Eden had not seen before. Not annoyance, not calculation, fear. He issued instructions with clipped efficiency, then followed as Eden was transferred onto the stretcher. For a moment, Callum's gaze flicked to the children, standing frozen in the corridor. The eldest boy did not blink. The middle boy's lips trembled. The youngest squeezed her rabbit until her knuckles whitened. Callum hesitated, as if there should have been a script for this. There wasn't. Eden heard the youngest whisper, barely audible, "Don't go." It hit Eden like a second contraction. He couldn't turn his head fully, but his eyes found hers. "I'm coming back," he managed, voice rough and thin. The words were too small to be a guarantee, but they were all he had. The doors closed behind the medical team. The air outside tasted colder, sharper. Eden's breath fogged faintly in the ambulance light. The ride to the private clinic blurred into a rhythm of pain and procedure. The paramedic spoke in calm instructions. An IV line was inserted. Vital signs were monitored. Eden's wristband was replaced by clinic sensors that looked more clinical but felt just as invasive. Callum drove behind the ambulance like a shadow that couldn't decide if it belonged close or far. In the private clinic, everything was sterile and efficient. Floors gleamed, voices stayed controlled, machines beeped with the indifferent certainty of technology. Eden was moved through hallways that smelled of disinfectant and money. He was placed under bright lights. He was told to breathe. He was told to push. He was told that everything was fine. It wasn't fine. It was real. It was violent. It was the body doing something no contract could soften. Hours passed in fragments. Eden lost time in waves of pain that erased thought. He gripped rails. He bit down on words he didn't want to say aloud. At one point he heard himself break, a soft, involuntary plea. "Please," he whispered, and it was unclear whether he meant, "Please stop, please live," or "Please don't leave me alone in this." Then the baby arrived and proved that bodies did not recognize legal categories. The first cry cut through the room, sharp and startling, a sound that did not care about wealth or image or clauses. The medical team moved quickly, checking breathing, clearing airways, recording measurements in words and numbers Eden couldn't focus on. The baby's skin looked impossibly fragile under the lights, red and damp, trembling with the shock of being alive. Someone placed the newborn against Eden's chest as protocol demanded, and the world narrowed. The baby's tiny hands clutched Eden's finger as if it was the only reliable thing in the universe. The cries softened within seconds. The breathing steadied. The heartbeat settled into a calmer rhythm. Eden felt the warmth of that small body against his own, and something inside him broke open so quietly it was almost invisible. Not ownership, not entitlement, recognition. Callum watched from the edge of the room, face tight with restraint. He had been present, but he looked like a man observing something he had not prepared for. Eden saw his eyes track the baby's response, the way calm arrived only in Eden's arms, and Callum's composure wavered, not anger. Not jealousy, something closer to grief. As if he had realized too late that he had treated parenthood like an asset acquisition, and now the baby was teaching him the only currency that mattered. Presence. When the baby was placed in Callum's arms, the infant's nervous system reacted immediately. Restless movements, a tightening of the tiny body, a sharp cry rising from the chest like alarm. Callum stiffened without meaning to. His scent sharpened, controlled and tense, the way it always did when he felt uncertain. The baby cried harder. Eden forced himself to stay calm, even as exhaustion shook him. He breathed slowly on purpose, letting the rhythm carry into the room. He stayed close, not interfering, just present, a steady anchor beside Callum's rigid uncertainty. The nurse coached Callum's hold, adjusting the baby's position, lowering the baby against the warmth of Callum's chest. Eden's voice came out barely above a whisper, soft and firm. "Breathe," he said, and it was not instruction for Callum alone. It was instruction for the room. Callum's shoulders lowered by a fraction. His breathing steadied. The baby's cries began to break into smaller sounds, then softened. The infant's body loosened in slow increments, as if learning that this new scent could become safe too, if it was not forced. For the first time, Callum understood that control would not make him a father. Time would, care would, and the Omega he had tried to keep as a temporary tool had become the bridge between his children and the child he had just welcomed. After the birth, the agency pushed for the exit timeline with the same calm urgency they used for risk management. The contract was clear. The compensation was ready. Forms were prepared for signatures. The language was polite and firm, as if the world could return to its intended shape if everyone cooperated. But the therapist's report had arrived earlier that day, delivered in clinical wording that carried a blunt warning. Abrupt removal of Eden would risk severe attachment trauma, not only for the newborn, whose first regulation had occurred against Eden's heartbeat, but for the 3 older children who had already anchored their hope to him. 4 children. 1 fragile system. Callum stood in the clinic corridor afterward, alone for a moment, hands still carrying the memory of the baby's weight. His phone held the contract. His other hand held the edge of a reality he could not rewrite with signatures. He faced a choice no contract could solve. And for the first time, the mansion's power felt smaller than the quiet truth of a baby's body choosing safety over paperwork.